The first frost of October 1887 came down from the book cliffs like a thief in the night, and it was the sound of a woman crying among dying vines that led Tobias Alden off the mountain trail and into the rest of his life. He had been 3 days coming down from his cabin in the high country above the Grand Valley, his mule loaded with pelts he meant to trade before the passes closed for winter, when the wind shifted and turned bitter in a way that made every hair on his forearms stand up beneath his buckskin coat. Tobias had spent 11 years reading weather the way other men read newspapers, and he knew before the stars fully came out that this was no ordinary autumn chill. This was a killing frost, early and vicious, the kind that could freeze a season's labor onto the vine in a single night. He heard her before he saw her. The crying carried strange and clear across the frozen ditches of the valley floor, high and broken, the kind of sound a man does not forget once he has heard it. Tobias reined his mule off the wagon road and followed the sound down through a stand of cottonwoods gone silver with early ice, until the trees opened onto row upon row of grapevines laid out in careful lines against the base of the mesa. And there, kneeling in the dirt between two rows with her shawl clutched uselessly around her shoulders, was Florence Doyle. She did not hear him approach at first. She was too busy pressing her palms against a vine as if her own warmth might undo what the sky had already done, her breath coming out in white clouds, her dark hair escaping its pins and whipping loose in the wind. The grapes on the vine before her had gone soft and translucent, the skins already beginning to weep their juice onto the frozen ground, and Tobias understood in an instant what he was looking at. He had seen frost take a man's garden before. He had never seen it break a woman's spirit quite so completely. "Ma'am," he said, low, so as not to startle her, though he startled her anyway. She spun with a small cry, one hand flying to the collar of her dress, and for a moment they only stared at each other in the blue dark, the mule shifting its feet behind him, the wind hissing through 10,000 leaves that were already curling black at the edges. "Who are you?" she asked, and though her voice shook, there was iron beneath it, the voice of a woman who had learned to be afraid of very little except the thing directly in front of her. "Tobias Alden," he said. "I trap up on the mesa. I was headed down to Grand Junction to trade before the passes shut." He nodded at the vines. "This your place?" "It was my husband's." The words came out clipped, final, and only then did he notice the black dress beneath the shawl, the kind of mourning dress a woman wears for a long while after the ground has closed over someone she loved. Samuel Doyle. He planted these vines 11 years ago, carried the cuttings out from Missouri wrapped in wet burlap the whole way. He is 2 years in his grave, and this harvest was going to be the one that finally paid off the debt on this land, and now look at it. Look at it. Her voice cracked on the last words, and she turned back to the vines as if she could not bear to let him see her face crumple. Tobias looked. Even in the poor light he could see the danger was not yet total. Frost had touched the tips of the rows nearest the open field where the cold air pooled, but the vines closer to the mesa wall, sheltered by the rock's slow-released warmth, still looked green and full. He had spent enough winters watching how cold settled into a valley, how it flowed like water and gathered in the low places, to know that this frost was not yet a death sentence. It was a warning, and there might still be hours left to answer it. "How much of your crop is out here?" he asked. 6 acres. "Malvasia, and a few rows of mission grapes my husband got from an old Spanish grower down in New Mexico territory." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, angry at her own tears even as they kept coming. "It does not matter how many acres. I cannot save 6 acres from the sky, Mr. Alden. I am one woman with no husband and no sons and a hired man who quit me a month ago because I could not pay him through the winter." "You are not one woman tonight," Tobias said, and swung down from the mule before he had entirely decided to do it. "Not unless you send me off." She looked at him properly then, for the first time taking in the breadth of him, the buckskin stretched tight across shoulders built up from years of hauling traps and felled timber, the dark hair grown long past his collar, the beard that had not seen a razor in some weeks. He was a mountain man in every particular. The kind of man the valley folk spoke of in low voices when they saw him come down for supplies twice a year, more legend than neighbor. And yet his eyes, when they met hers, held nothing wild in them at all. They held only a steady, quiet attention, the look of a man deciding how best to help. "I do not have money to pay you," Florence said. "I did not ask for money." "Then why would you help a stranger's vines freeze or not freeze? It is nothing to you." Tobias considered the question honestly before he answered it, because he did not believe in giving a woman a false reason. "Because I have watched things I could not save go under the snow before," he said. "And because there is still time, if we move quick, to keep the sky from taking what you have got left. I would rather work through the cold than lie in my blankets tonight knowing I let it happen when I might have stopped it." Something in his plain honesty seemed to reach her more than any polished comfort could have. Florence Doyle straightened her shoulders, swiped the last of the tears from her face with a decisiveness that told him she had made up her mind, and said, "Then tell me what you need, Mr. Alden, and I will fetch it." That was how the night began. Tobias had learned frost fighting from an old French-Canadian trapper he had wintered with in his first years in the mountains, a man who had once kept orchards in Quebec before drink and restlessness carried him west. The principle was simple enough to explain and brutal enough in practice to test any two people before dawn. Cold air was heavier than warm air, and it pooled in low ground the way water pooled in a creek bed. If a body could keep the air moving, keep it stirred and warmed even a few degrees, the vines might survive a night that would otherwise kill them outright. "We need fire," he told her, striding down the rows to judge the lay of the land by starlight. "Smudge fires low and smoking all along the low end of the field where the cold is settling. Not big flame. Smoke and heat both, slow burning. You have got old fence rails, dead wood, anything green enough to smoke instead of blaze quick. There is a woodpile behind the barn. Cuttings from the pruning mostly, and some old crates." Florence was already moving, her skirts gathered in one fist, leading him at a near run toward the outbuildings silhouetted against the mesa. Samuel always said the prunings were good for nothing but kindling. Tonight they are good for everything. They worked through the deep hours of that October night in a way neither of them would ever fully describe afterward to anyone who had not lived through a frost fight themselves, because there was no way to make it sound like anything but what it was. Hard, filthy, freezing labor, shot through with a strange, fierce joy neither of them expected to feel. Tobias built the first smudge fire at the low end of the vineyard where the cold pooled thickest, laying green cuttings over dry kindling, so the fire would smoke thick and slow rather than leap up and burn itself out. Florence fetched water in buckets from the irrigation ditch that ran along the base of the mesa, and together they went vine by vine down the rows nearest the frost line, wetting the ground around the roots. "Water holds heat longer than dry dirt," Tobias explained, when she asked why they were soaking ground that was already so cold it ached to touch. "It will not save every vine, but it will slow how fast the cold gets into the roots, and that might be the difference between losing a crop and losing a night's sleep. You sound like you have done this before. Once or twice. For other men's crops mostly. Never for my own." He did not explain further, and something in the set of his jaw told her not to ask that night, though she filed the answer away to return to later. By midnight they had a dozen smudge fires smoking low along the vineyard's lower edge, throwing a haze of warm, acrid smoke across the rows that made both their eyes water and their throats burn. And Florence had lost feeling in her fingers twice over from hauling water. Tobias noticed her hands shaking as she lifted another bucket and took it from her without asking, his own bare fingers closing over hers for just a moment in the transfer, warm despite the cold, calloused in a way that spoke of years of hard use. "You will do yourself an injury," he said. "Go warm your hands at the fire a spell. I will keep at the watering. It is my vineyard, Mr. Alden. My husband's legacy. I am not going to stand by a fire while you save it for me." "I am not asking you to stand by while I save it. I am asking you to warm your hands so you can keep helping me save it, because you will be no use to these vines with fingers too frozen to lift a bucket." There was no scold in his voice, only a plain, practical concern that undid her resistance faster than any argument could have. She went briefly and stood with her hands stretched toward the smoky flame, and when she looked back down the row, she saw Tobias moving between the vines with the tireless, economical strength of a man built for exactly this kind of work, and something in her chest, frozen for 2 long years of grief, gave the smallest crack. Around 2 in the morning, when the cold had reached its cruelest, and the stars overhead burned with the hard, merciless clarity that only comes on the worst frost nights, Florence found herself working alongside him rather than merely following his direction, matching his pace down the rows, learning by watching how he judged which vines needed water and which needed only smoke, which fires needed feeding and which could be left to smolder low. They spoke little at first, saving their breath for the labor, but as the night wore on and the rhythm of the work settled into something almost companionable, the silence began to fill with small exchanges. "Your husband," Tobias said at one point, feeding another armful of green cuttings into a fire that had begun to burn too clean. "He brought these vines all the way from Missouri, wrapped the roots in wet burlap and carried them in a trunk the whole way west, like they were his own children," Florence said, and there was a warmth in her voice now, a warmth that had not been there when she spoke of him before, as if the labor had thawed something in her memory as well as her hands. "He used to say a vine was the most patient thing God ever made. You could near kill it with drought, freeze it half to death, cut it back to nothing every winter, and it would still come back green in the spring so long as the roots held. He believed that about people too, said it was why he married me, on account of I had roots that held. Sounds like a man worth missing. He was." She looked at him sideways over the low orange light of the fire. "You lost someone too. I can hear it in the way you talk about not being able to save things before." Tobias did not answer right away. He straightened from the fire, wiped his hands on his buckskin trousers, and looked off toward the dark shape of the mesa rising black against the stars before he spoke. "My wife," he said finally, "6 years back. We had a cabin up near the head of a canyon and a garden she kept and a boy on the way. Spring flood came down out of the high country faster than anybody expected, took the cabin and half the hillside with it. I was 2 days out checking trap lines. By the time I got back, there was nothing left to bury but what the creek gave up 3 miles downstream." He said it flat, the way a man says a thing he has told himself 1,000 times until the telling no longer opens the wound fresh, though Florence could see in the tightness around his eyes that some wounds never fully close no matter how many times a man tells the story to himself in the dark. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean to make you speak of it. You did not make me do anything I was not willing to do." He looked at her then, steady, and something passed between them in that look that neither of them had words for yet, a recognition of matching grief, matching loneliness, 2 people who had each spent years learning to carry a weight alone, and had just discovered, in the middle of a frozen vineyard at 2 in the morning, that the weight felt strangely lighter shared. "That is part of why I came down off the mountain tonight, instead of riding on past your crying and minding my own business," he added. "I know what it is to watch something you love go under and not be able to stop it. I was not about to let it happen twice in one lifetime if I could put my back into stopping it." They worked until the sky in the east began to gray, feeding the smudge fires, hauling water, wrapping the most tender young vines near the field's edge in burlap sacking Florence dragged out from the barn, until every muscle in both their bodies ached with a bone-deep exhaustion that neither of them had felt in years, the good kind of exhaustion that comes from having given everything to a fight and not yet knowing if it was won. When the first true light broke over the book cliffs and touched the vineyard rows with pale gold, Florence walked the length of the field with her heart in her throat, checking vine after vine, and found, to her own disbelieving joy, that the great majority of her crop still hung green and whole upon the trellises. Only the outermost rows, farthest from the smoke and water, had taken real damage, a loss any vintner would grieve but one the vineyard could survive. She stood at the end of the last row with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears coming again. But these tears were entirely different from the ones that had brought Tobias Alden off the mountain trail the night before. Tobias came up beside her, soot-streaked and swaying slightly on his feet with tiredness, and looked out over the saved rows with a quiet satisfaction that needed no words. "We did it," Florence said, half laughing through her tears. "Mr. Alden, we truly did it." "You did it," Tobias said. "I only kept the fires fed. You kept a great deal more than the fires fed tonight." She turned to face him fully then in the growing light, and for the first time she let herself really look at him without the fear and grief clouding her sight. And what she saw was a man of considerable size and strength, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of years of hard mountain labor, his dark hair loose and tangled with soot and sweat, his face weathered by wind and sun, but not unkind, not hard in the way she had expected of a man who lived alone above the timber line. There was gentleness folded into all that strength, the particular gentleness of a man who had learned, through loss, exactly how much a small kindness could matter to someone with nothing else left standing. "I have not thanked you properly," she said, "and I have nothing to offer in payment, but I have coffee in the house and eggs from the hens, and I would be glad to feed you before you go on to Grand Junction, if you would allow it." Tobias looked at her a long moment, weighing something behind his tired eyes before he nodded. "I would be glad of that, Mrs. Doyle, glad of it indeed." The house Florence led him to was a low adobe and timber structure set at the edge of the vineyard, built by her late husband's own hands in the manner common to the valley settlers, who had learned building craft from the older Spanish and Mexican families, who had farmed these river bottoms for generations before the Anglo homesteaders arrived with the railroad survey crews. It was modest but well kept, a home that had clearly known love and industry both, though Tobias could see in the bare patches on the walls where pictures or shelves had once hung and been sold off, and in the thinness of the coffee Florence poured, the signs of a household straining hard against debt. They ate in near silence at first, both of them too wrung out from the night's labor for much conversation. But as the coffee and the warmth of the little kitchen stove worked their way into their tired bodies, talk came easier. Florence told him, in pieces, about Samuel Doyle, how he had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri before the wanderlust and the promise of cheap irrigated land in the new Colorado Territory had drawn him west, how he had fallen in love with the idea of grapes the way some men fell in love with gold, convinced that the volcanic soil and long dry summers of the Grand Valley could grow fruit as fine as anything from the old countries. How he had died of a fever 2 winters past, leaving her with 6 acres of vines half paid for, and a debt at the Grand Junction Bank that grew a little heavier every season the harvest came in thin. "There is a man in town," she said, staring into her coffee cup rather than at him, "Mr. Ezra Wickham, who holds the note on this land. He has made it known more than once that he would take the vineyard off my hands for what I owe him and count himself generous for the offer. He says a woman alone cannot make a vineyard pay, and perhaps he is right. I have thought so myself on the worst nights." "Was last night one of the worst nights?" "Last night," Florence said, and for the first time that morning something like a real smile touched her face, "was the night I stopped believing him." Tobias left that morning as he had said he would, riding on to Grand Junction with his mule and his pelts, and Florence watched him go from her porch with a strange hollow feeling in her chest that she did not examine too closely, telling herself it was only tiredness, only the ordinary letdown after a long crisis survived. But she found herself, over the following days, listening for the sound of hooves on the wagon road more often than she would have admitted to anyone, and she found that the memory of his steady voice in the dark, telling her water, holds heat longer than dry dirt, stayed with her in a way that had nothing to do with vineyard husbandry, and everything to do with the particular ache of being cared for by someone who asked nothing in return. He came back on the fourth day, and told himself he had come back only to check that the vines had truly held, though he had traded his pelts and settled his business in town 2 days prior, and had no earthly reason to still be in the valley at all. He found Florence in the vineyard with a pair of shears, cutting away the frost-damaged rows at the field's edge, her sleeves rolled and her face flushed with work, and when she saw him coming up the wagon road on his mule she straightened so quickly she nearly dropped the shears, and the smile that broke across her face was unguarded in a way neither of them expected. "Mr. Alden," she called, "I did not think to see you again." "I had business yet unfinished in the valley," he said, which was a lie, and both of them seemed to know it, though neither called it out. "What business is that?" "Making sure a certain vineyard did not go and freeze after all once I was not there to feed the fires." Florence laughed, a real laugh, the first he had heard from her, and it did something strange and pleasant to the center of his chest. "The vineyard is saved, Mr. Alden. You may see the proof of it yourself. Come, walk the rows with me, and tell me if you think I have judged the pruning right." He stayed the better part of that day, and though he told himself each hour that he ought to be riding back up toward his cabin before the light failed, he found reasons to linger, first to help her stack the pruned wood, then to look over the trellis wire that had come loose along one row, then simply to sit with her on the porch steps as the sun went down gold and orange over the mesa, drinking coffee that tasted better to him than any he had drunk in years, though he suspected the improvement had less to do with the beans than the company. Over the following weeks, as October gave way to the deep chill of November and the harvest itself came due, Tobias found himself returning to the Doyle vineyard again and again, at first with the excuse of checking on frost risk, then simply because he wanted to be there, because something about the rhythm of Florence's days, the steady industry of her hands, the quiet strength with which she carried her grief and her debts and her land all at once, had settled into him in a way he had not felt since before the flood took his wife, an unborn child, from him. He helped her bring in the harvest that autumn, working alongside her hired help, and, when help was too dear to pay for, working alongside her alone, hauling baskets of dark purple grapes from the vine to the crush house Samuel had built years before, a modest stone structure with a hand-cranked press that Florence operated with a competence that surprised him every time he watched her work it. "You know this trade well," he told her one afternoon, watching her check the sugar content of the crushed juice by tasting it straight from the vat, her nose wrinkling in concentration. "Samuel taught me everything he knew," she said. "He used to say a vintner's wife who could not tell a good muss from a poor one was no help to him at all, so he taught me the same as he would have taught a son, had we been given one." A shadow crossed her face at that, brief and private, and Tobias did not press her on it, sensing there was old sorrow there beyond the loss of her husband, sorrow about children that had never come, that she was not yet ready to share with him. The harvest that year, thin as it was after the frost damage, still brought in enough juice to fill a respectable number of barrels, and when the last basket had been crushed and the cellar doors shut on the fermenting wine, Florence stood in the crush house doorway and wept again, though this time Tobias understood immediately that these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than despair, and he did not hesitate to cross the small distance between them and fold her, gently, into an embrace that she did not resist. "We saved it," she said into his chest, her voice muffled and thick. "We truly saved it, Tobias." It was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt the small syllables land on him like a blessing. "You saved it," he said again, as he had said the morning after the frost. "I only kept the fires fed. You keep saying that, as though feeding fires and hauling water and staying up 3 nights running to watch over another person's crop is a small thing. It is not a small thing, Tobias Alden. It is the largest thing anyone has done for me since Samuel died." She drew back enough to look up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something else besides, something that made his heart beat hard and slow in his chest. "I do not know how to thank you properly for it." "You do not need to thank me at all," he said low. "Florence, I did not come back down off that mountain 4 more times because I was worried about frost. I came back because I could not stop thinking about you, weeping over those vines, and about how much I wanted to be the man who made sure you never had to weep alone again." The confession hung between them in the cool cellar air, and for a long moment neither of them moved, both of them aware of the enormity of what had just been said, of what it might mean for 2 people who had each buried a spouse and sworn, in their private grief, never to risk that particular kind of loss again. It was Florence who closed the distance first, rising on her toes to press her lips to his, tentative at first and then with a growing certainty as he responded, his arms tightening around her, one broad hand coming up to cradle the back of her head with a tenderness that belied the raw strength of him. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Florence laughed again, that same unguarded laugh, and pressed her forehead to his chest. "I did not expect this," she admitted. "I did not expect to want this again." "Neither did I," Tobias said, "but I am not sorry for it, are you?" "No," Florence said, and meant it with her whole battered, healing heart. "I am not sorry at all." Word of the courtship between the widow Doyle and the mountain man traveled through the small farming community of the Grand Valley, the way word travels through any small place, which is to say quickly and with considerable embellishment, and not everyone received the news with good will. Chief among the disapproving was Ezra Wickham, the Grand Junction banker who held the note on Florence's land and who had, for the better part of 2 years, nursed a private hope that her mounting debts would eventually force her to sell to him at a price far below the vineyard's true worth. Land he intended to fold into a larger holding he was quietly assembling along the river bottom. Wickham was not an evil man in the theatrical sense, only a small and grasping one, the kind of man the frontier bred in abundance alongside its heroes, a man who mistook patience for virtue when in truth it was only greed willing to wait. He came to call on Florence on a cold afternoon in late November, his buggy pulled up smart in front of the house, his black coat brushed clean of the road dust in a way that suggested he had stopped somewhere along the way to make himself presentable, and Florence received him on the porch rather than inside, a small but deliberate discourtesy that told him plainly how welcome he was. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, tipping his hat with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "I hear your harvest came in despite the frost, a fine piece of fortune." "It was not fortune, Mr. Wickham. It was hard work through a long cold night with help I was grateful to receive." "Ah, yes," the mountain man, Wickham's smile thinned. "The valley does love to talk, Mrs. Doyle, and I confess I have heard a great deal of talk about you and Mr. Alden these past weeks. I wonder if you have considered how such talk reflects upon a respectable widow, a woman alone, entertaining a trapper of no fixed address, no property, no standing in this community. Mr. Alden has more honor in him than any man I have met in this valley, yourself included," Florence said, her voice sharpening. "If you have come here to lecture me on respectability, Mr. Wickham, I will thank you to state your true business and be gone. I know you did not ride out here in your good coat merely to comment on my company." Wickham's composure slipped for just a moment before he recovered it. "Very well. Direct as always, Mrs. Doyle. I have always admired it, even when it works against your own interests. The note on this land comes due in full this coming spring, as you well know. 6 acres of frost-damaged vines and a thin harvest will not cover what you owe, not with the interest accrued. I am prepared to offer you a fair price for the land now, sparing you the indignity of foreclosure, and you may take the money and start fresh somewhere less demanding of a woman's strength than a vineyard. And if I refuse, then I expect we shall speak again in the spring, under less pleasant circumstances for you." He tipped his hat once more, the gesture somehow more insulting for its politeness, and climbed back into his buggy. Consider it carefully, Mrs. Doyle. Sentiment does not pay bank notes. Florence stood on the porch long after his buggy had rattled off down the wagon road, her jaw set, her hands trembling with a fury she rarely allowed herself to feel so openly. When Tobias arrived an hour later, having ridden down from a stretch of days spent checking his trap lines before the deep winter snows closed the high passes entirely, he found her still standing in nearly the same spot, staring off toward town with an expression that worried him immediately. "What happened?" he asked, swinging down from his mule before it had fully stopped. She told him the whole exchange, her voice tight with the effort of keeping her composure, and Tobias listened with his jaw growing harder by the sentence, though he said nothing until she had finished. "How much do you owe him?" $400 with the interest. I have perhaps $150 from this year's crush. Once I sell the barrels come spring, and that assumes the wine sells well and does not spoil in the aging. She sat down heavily on the porch step, the fight draining out of her all at once now that the confrontation itself was over. "I do not see how I make up the difference by spring, Tobias. Not honestly." Tobias sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed warm against hers, and thought for a long moment before he spoke. "I have my own money," he said. "Not much, by a banker's reckoning, but I have trapped and traded 11 years with almost nothing to spend it on but supplies and ammunition. I have near $300 saved back in a strongbox at my cabin, money I never had cause to spend on anything, because there was never anything up on that mountain worth spending it for." He turned to look at her. "There is now, Tobias, I cannot ask you to give me your savings. You are not asking, I am offering." He took her hand, his own so much larger and rougher than hers, and held it with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. "Florence, I have thought on this a great deal these past weeks, more than I have thought on anything in a long while, and I do not want to keep coming down off that mountain to visit you like a man courting from a distance. I want to be here. I want to build a life in this valley, with you, if you will have me, and I would rather spend every dollar I have saved making that possible than keep it locked in a box for a future I do not want unless you are part of it." Florence's eyes filled, though this time the tears came from a fullness in her chest rather than an emptiness. "Tobias Alden, are you asking me to marry you? I believe I am making rather a poor job of it, but yes, I am asking." He managed a small, crooked smile, the first she had seen from him that carried any real nervousness. "I have got no ring to offer you, and no house of my own down here in the valley. Only a cabin up the mountain that would suit a trapper better than a vintner's widow. But I have got 2 strong arms and a back that does not tire easy, and I have got a heart that has been half frozen for 6 years, and only started thawing the night I found you weeping over those vines. I would be honored, Florence, more honored than I know how to say, if you would let me spend the rest of my life keeping the frost off everything you love." "Yes," Florence said, before he had even fully finished, laughing and crying together in a way that seemed to surprise them both. "Yes, Tobias, of course, yes." They were married in December, in the small Methodist chapel in Grand Junction, on a day cold and clear, with the first real snow of winter dusting the mesa tops white. And though the wedding was small, attended mostly by the handful of valley neighbors who had come to respect Florence's grit over the years and had, in recent weeks, come to respect the quiet, steady mountain man at her side as well, it was not without its moment of drama. Ezra Wickham, uninvited but apparently unable to resist witnessing what he clearly hoped might still fall through, stood at the back of the small congregation with his arms crossed, and it was only when Tobias, at the reception held afterward in the vineyard's own barn, walked directly up to him and counted out $300 in coin and bank notes to settle the debt in full, well ahead of the spring deadline, that the banker's expression finally cracked from smug patience into something closer to defeat. "You have paid off the note," Wickham said, staring at the money as though it had personally offended him. "I have," Tobias said. "In full, with the interest you named, and I will thank you to have the release papers drawn up and delivered within the week, so my wife may hold clear title to her own land without further visits from you." He said wife with a quiet pride that carried across the barn to where Florence stood among the well-wishers, and she felt the warmth of it settle into her bones like the first sun after a long winter. Wickham had no answer for that but to take his money and go, and though he remained a fixture of Grand Junction's business dealings for years afterward, he never again rode out to the Doyle vineyard, nor did he ever again call Florence anything but Mrs. Alden, with something almost like grudging respect, whenever their paths crossed in town. The early months of the marriage were not without their difficulties, for Tobias was a man accustomed to solitude, to the particular silence of the high mountains where a man's only conversation for weeks at a time might be with his mule or the wind, and the adjustment to a shared house, a shared bed, a shared life bound up in the demands of a working vineyard, tested him in ways the mountains never had. He moved his few belongings down from the cabin that winter, selling off some of his trapping gear to buy a proper wagon and a second mule, and threw himself into learning the vintner's trade with the same dogged patience he had once given to reading animal sign and weather patterns, until by the following spring he could prune a vine nearly as well as Florence herself, though he never did develop her instinct for judging when the grapes had reached their perfect sugar. Florence, for her part, had to learn a different kind of patience, the patience of loving a man who sometimes needed to walk out alone into the fields at dusk and simply stand there, facing the mountains, saying nothing, working through some private echo of old grief that even a happy marriage could not fully erase. She learned not to follow him on those walks, but to have coffee waiting and warm when he came back in, and to ask no questions unless he offered the answers himself, and in time those walks grew less frequent and shorter, as the roots of their new life together grew deep enough to hold him steady even when memory pulled hard at his feet. There were lighter difficulties too, ones that made them both laugh once the frustration passed. Tobias, used to cooking over an open trapper's fire, very nearly burned down the kitchen in his first attempt to help Florence with the cooking, and was banished from the stove entirely after that, relegated instead to chopping wood and hauling water, tasks at which he excelled without complaint. Florence, in turn, discovered she had no talent whatsoever for skinning game, and after one disastrous attempt at dressing a deer Tobias had brought home, the two of them settled into a comfortable division of labor. He handled the hunting and the heaviest field work. She handled the cellar and the books and the delicate business of selling their wine to merchants as far away as Denver. And between the two of them, the vineyard that had nearly been lost to a single frozen night began, slowly and steadily, to prosper as it never had under Samuel Doyle's more scholarly, less practical management. By the following autumn, a full year after the night that had brought them together, the vineyard yielded its finest harvest in a decade, 6 acres grown to 8 as Tobias cleared and planted new ground along the mesa's base. The extra land purchased outright with money, earned from 2 successful crushes rather than borrowed from any bank. Florence stood in the crush house that second harvest, watching her husband haul basket after basket of dark, heavy grapes with the same tireless strength he had shown the night they met, and felt a happiness so complete it nearly frightened her, the particular fear of a woman who has lost once before and knows now, with painful clarity, exactly how much she has to lose again. She voiced that fear to him one night that winter, as they lay together beneath heavy quilts while snow piled soft and silent against the window panes, the fires banked low, the vines outside sleeping safely beneath their own blanket of straw mulch that Tobias had spread thick along every row before the first real cold arrived. "I am afraid sometimes," she admitted, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Afraid that loving you this much means I have that much more to lose if anything should happen. I lost Samuel so suddenly, Tobias. One week he was well, and the next he was gone, and I do not know if I have the strength to survive losing again the way I did then." Tobias was quiet a long moment, his arms tightening around her before he answered. "I lost my wife and the child we were expecting in a single afternoon, Florence, with no warning at all. And for 6 years afterward I told myself the mountains were safer than loving anyone, because the mountains never asked anything of me they took away again without at least some fair trade. Furs for supplies, solitude for peace. I thought that was the only honest bargain left to me." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But I was wrong. I spent 6 years up on that mountain thinking I was protecting myself from grief, and all I was really doing was refusing to live at all. I would rather love you with everything I have, and risk the grief that might someday come with it, than go back to that kind of half-living ever again. Whatever time we are given, Florence, I intend to spend every day of it grateful I found you weeping over those vines, and not sorry for a single moment of the risk." Florence found, in the months and years that followed, that his words proved true not merely as sentiment, but as the shape of their actual life together, a life that continued to test them in the ordinary ways that any marriage on the frontier was tested, and continued, each time, to hold. There was the summer a wildfire crept close along the mesa's dry grass, and Tobias organized the valley men into a bucket line that saved not only the Doyle vineyard but 3 neighboring farms besides. His mountain-honed instincts for reading wind and fire proving as valuable to the community as his frost-fighting knowledge had once proven to Florence alone. There was the spring a late blizzard threatened the new grape buds just as they broke dormancy, and the two of them fought through another long cold night with smudge fires and burlap wraps, though this time they fought side by side as equal partners rather than as a stranger and a widow thrown together by chance. And this time, when dawn broke over the saved vines, they celebrated not with tears of relief, but with the easy, settled joy of two people who had learned to trust that, whatever the sky threw at them, they would meet it together. There was also, in the 3rd year of their marriage, a joy neither of them had dared to hope for after so much loss. Florence had feared, given the years without children in her first marriage, that she might never carry a child at all, and had made a quiet peace with that possibility long before she ever met Tobias Alden. But in the spring of 1890, she discovered she was carrying, and told Tobias the news on the porch steps where he had once offered her his savings and his heart in the same breath, watching his face move through disbelief, joy, and a fear so raw it brought tears to his own eyes, fear born of memory, of a flood and a cabin and a grief he had carried silently for 6 long years before she found her way into his life. "I am frightened," he admitted to her that night, holding her carefully as though she might shatter, though she was not yet even showing. "I lost a child once before it ever drew breath, Florence. I do not know how I will bear the waiting." "You will bear it the same way you bore that frozen night in the vineyard," Florence told him, taking his rough hand and pressing it flat against her stomach, over the place where their child was only just beginning to grow. "1 hour at a time, with your whole heart in it, and with me beside you the entire way. We will not lose this one, Tobias. I believe that with everything I have." Their son was born that winter, a healthy, loud-voiced boy they named Samuel Tobias Alden, honoring both the man who had planted the vines and the man who had learned to tend them. And if there had been any lingering doubt in the valley about the mountain man who had married the Vintners' widow, it dissolved entirely the day word spread of the birth, and half the valley's women arrived at the Alden farmhouse bearing quilts and pies and casseroles, welcoming the newest member of a community that had, without quite meaning to, adopted Tobias Alden as thoroughly as he had once adopted their harvest. A daughter followed 2 years later, a dark-haired girl they named Margaret after Tobias's own mother, long dead back in the eastern states he rarely spoke of. And then, 4 years after that, a second son, rounding out a family that filled the once too quiet house with a noise and warmth that Tobias, in his solitary years on the mountain, could never have imagined himself capable of wanting so completely. The vineyard itself grew alongside the family, expanding to 15 acres by the turn of the new century, its wines known and respected as far as the markets of Denver, and even, on occasion, shipped east by rail to buyers who had heard tell of the fine dark wines coming out of the Colorado high country. Florence oversaw the crush and the cellar with the same steady expertise she had shown that first frozen night, and Tobias, though he never fully lost the quiet watchfulness of a man who had spent his youth alone in the mountains, found in the rows of vines and the noise of his growing children a peace he had once believed lost to him forever. Buried alongside his first wife in a canyon he still visited once a year, each spring, to leave a handful of wildflowers on the rocky ground where her grave had never properly been dug, and where he had finally, after years of guilt, learned to grieve without also drowning. Florence went with him on those yearly visits, standing quietly at his side while he spoke a few private words to a woman she had never known but had come, through Tobias's occasional stories, to feel a strange and grateful kinship with, a woman whose loss had shaped the man Florence loved into someone capable of such fierce, careful tenderness. She never begrudged him those visits, understanding as she did the particular arithmetic of grief and love that neither cancels the other out nor demands that one be surrendered for the sake of the other, but simply lives alongside it, the way a vine lives alongside the harsh seasons that shape it, growing stronger and more deeply rooted for having survived them. On the 10th anniversary of the night the frost had nearly claimed her harvest, Florence walked out alone into the vineyard at dusk, as had become a small private ritual of her own, to stand among the rows and remember. The vines around her now stretched far beyond the original 6 acres Samuel Doyle had planted, thick and old and heavy with fruit nearly ready for the crush, and the mesa behind them caught the last gold light of the day in a way that never failed to catch at her heart, no matter how many autumns she had watched it happen. She heard footsteps behind her and did not need to turn to know who approached, recognizing the particular weight and rhythm of Tobias Alden's stride even after all these years together. "You are remembering that night," he said, coming to stand beside her, slipping one strong arm around her waist as their 2 younger children's voices carried faintly from the house behind them, Margaret's laughter rising sharp and bright over her younger brother's protests about some game gone unfairly against him, while their eldest, Samuel, old enough now to be trusted with real responsibility, could be heard directing the hired hands in stacking the last of the harvest crates with an authority that reminded Florence, with a pang of bittersweet pride, of his namesake. "I am always remembering it this time of year," Florence said. "I think I always will. It was the worst night of my life, right up until the moment it became the best one. Are you sorry it happened the way it did? The debt, the frost, all of it. If none of that had come to pass, you would never have been out here weeping when I came down the trail." Florence turned in his arms to look up at him, at the face she had come to know so completely over 10 years of marriage, the lines that had deepened around his eyes from squinting into mountain sun and from laughing, now, far more often than he ever had before she knew him, the streaks of gray that had begun to show at his temples and that she found, if anything, only made her love him more for the years they marked, years spent together rather than apart. "No," she said. "I am not sorry for a single moment of it, not the frost, not the debt, not even the grief that came before, because every hard thing that happened to me led me, in the end, to that vineyard row and to you. I would live through that frozen night 100 times over, Tobias Alden, if I knew for certain it would lead me here again, every time." He kissed her then, slow and unhurried, the way a man kisses a woman he has loved for a decade and intends to love for decades more, and around them the vines stood heavy and safe in the golden evening light, tended and protected against every threat the sky might yet send down from the mountains, exactly as they had been every autumn since the night a mountain man had followed the sound of weeping through frozen rows and found, instead of only a harvest worth saving, the whole rest of his life waiting there among the vines for him to claim it. That night, after the children had been put to bed and the last of the day's work in the crush house was done, Tobias and Florence sat together on the porch steps as they so often did, wrapped in a single shared blanket against the evening chill, and talked, as they also so often did, about small ordinary things. The price the wine merchants in Denver were offering that season, whether young Samuel showed promise enough to take over management of the Eastern Rose in a few more years, whether Margaret's fascination with her mother's account books meant she might grow into the family's bookkeeper, the way Florence herself had grown into that role after Samuel Doyle's death. These were not the conversations of high drama or grand passion, but Florence had come to understand, in her decade of marriage to Tobias Alden, that this was precisely what a lasting love was built from. Not merely the singular, blazing night that brought two people together, but the 10,000 quiet evenings afterward, spent side by side, tending what had been saved. Above them, the same stars that had watched over that first desperate night of smudge fires and frozen vines wheeled slowly across a clear autumn sky, and somewhere out past the edge of the lamplight, the vineyard rose stretched dark and rustling in the cool night breeze, safe now, rooted deep, thriving under the care of two people who had once been strangers to each other and had become, through fire and frost and hard-won trust, the truest kind of family. Florence rested her head against Tobias's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the enduring strength of the arm wrapped around her, and thought, as she often did on nights like this, that she had been wrong once to believe that grief was the only harvest life had left to offer her. There had been another harvest waiting all along, one she had never thought to hope for again after Samuel's death, and it had come to her not on a gentle summer evening, but in the very worst hour of the very worst night, carried down off a cold mountain by a quiet, powerful, gentle stranger who had heard her weeping and refused to ride on by. The wine they made that year, and every year after, came to be known throughout the valley and beyond as some of the finest pressed in the whole of western Colorado, dark and rich and complex. And though none of the merchants who purchased it in Denver or Pueblo or points further east ever knew the full story behind its making, Florence liked to think that something of that first desperate, frost-fought night lived on in every bottle. The smoke and the cold water, and the two exhausted, hopeful people who had refused, between them, to let anything precious be lost without a fight. It was, she thought, a fitting legacy for a vineyard built on patience and roots that held, and a fitting beginning for a love that had proven, through a decade of harvests and hardships and quiet, ordinary evenings on a porch beneath the Colorado stars, every bit as enduring as the vines themselves. In the years that followed, the Alden family's reputation in the Grand Valley grew alongside their wine, and travelers passing through Grand Junction on the new rail lines heard tell, now and again, of the mountain man who had married the Vintners' widow and saved her harvest with nothing but fire and water and his own two hands, a story told and retold around supper tables and in the shade of the depot platform until it took on the polished shine of local legend. Embellished here and there, but never far from the truth of what had actually happened that frozen October night in 1887. Florence herself never minded the embellishments, laughing along whenever some new version of the tale reached her ears, though she always made certain, whenever asked directly, to set the story straight for her own children and eventually, many years later, for grandchildren who begged to hear again and again how their grandfather had come down off the mountain and found their grandmother weeping among the vines. "Tell it true, Mama," young Margaret would say, curled against her mother's side on winter evenings while snow piled against the windows much as it had that very first winter. "Tell us how it really happened, not the way Mrs. Prout tells it at church with the wolves and the blizzard that was not really there." And Florence would tell it true, every time. The frost, the tears, the sound of hooves on the frozen road, The smudge fires and the buckets of water and the long, cold hours of labor that had saved not only 6 acres of Malvasia and mission grapes, but 2 grieving hearts that had each, in their own private way, given up on ever being whole again. She told them about Samuel Doyle, the schoolteacher who had first planted the vines and dreamed of Colorado wine as fine as any from the old countries, honoring his memory even as she built a new life and a new love in the soil he had first turned. She told them about the flood that had taken Tobias's first family, about the 6 lonely years he had spent on the mountain believing solitude was the only honest bargain left to him, and about the moment, standing in a crush house with the smell of fermenting grapes thick in the air, that he had finally let himself hope for something more than mere survival. And always at the end of the telling, Tobias himself would appear in the doorway, drawn by the familiar rhythm of the story even after so many years of hearing it. His hair gone properly gray now, but his shoulders still broad and strong from a lifetime of hard work. And he would catch Florence's eye across the room with the same steady, quiet attention he had shown her that very first night. And she would know, without either of them needing to say a single word, that whatever the years still had in store for them, frost or fire or the ordinary slow erosion of time itself, they would face it exactly as they had faced that first desperate night, together, with fire enough between them to hold back any cold the world might send, and roots grown too deep and too entwined ever again to be pulled apart. The vineyard endured for the rest of both their long lives, passed eventually to their son Samuel and his own growing family. The old vine Samuel Doyle had first carried west from Missouri, still bearing fruit generations later, their gnarled trunks thick with the particular resilience of things that have survived hard winters and come back green regardless, exactly as Samuel Doyle himself had once promised his young wife they would. And on quiet autumn evenings, long after Tobias Alden's dark hair had gone entirely silver and Florence's hands had grown soft with age rather than roughened by field work, the two of them could still be found walking the rows together at dusk, her hand tucked into the crook of his still strong arm, both of them remembering, with a gratitude neither grief nor time had ever managed to diminish, the frozen night that had brought them, against every reasonable expectation, exactly to each other, and had never, not once in all the years that followed, let either of them go.